Here's Father Dave.
Well, on this edition of the Busted Halo Show, we're, as we have been for the last couple of weeks, mostly it seems our topics of conversation, just like everything else in the media and on the news, tends to be about what's going on because of this coronavirus pandemic. But today we've got a little expert voice in the conversation. We're pleased to welcome back friend of the show, Dr. Charles Camosy. He is Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University. And he's the founding member of the Organizing Committee for an International Conference designed to think and speak differently about abortion, the founder and co-director of the Catholic Conversation Project, an editor and contributor for CatholicMoralTheology.com, and a member of Cardinal Dolan's pro-life advisory board here in the Archdiocese of New York. He's also authored several books, including his latest, Resisting Throwaway Culture, How a Consistent Life Ethic Can Unite a Fractured People. Welcome back to the Busted Halo Show, Dr. Charlie Camosy. Hello.
Welcome. Hello, Father Dave.
Welcome back.
Are we far enough away from each other?
I think we have a little social distance,
Okay.
thanks to the Zoom.
Just want to make sure.
You get to see all of us on the little squares, little Hollywood squares. Brady
This
Bunch
is very
style.
Interesting. It's very interesting.
Now,
I learned something about each of you.
Have you been teaching like this with the technology?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the verb I would use, but we're doing something that's involving the internet, which, as you know, is just a series of tubes. But we're doing our best. We got thrown into this in the middle of the semester, and we're just hoping. I'm at least desperately hoping we can get into a situation where we can teach in person, because there's something about embodied teaching that is so powerful and so important. I don't want to risk losing that, but.
Well, and also, I just saw a recent poll that students from something like kindergarten through college, they asked a wide variety, like, would you rather be back in school? And surprisingly, yes, the answer was yes.
My kids would probably answer yes in response to that. I think it has less to do about the internet and more to do about the parents.
Because now, in addition to having to be a professor and teaching people virtually, you also are somewhat involved in your kids' educations now?
Yes, I make them do an afternoon report after their online assignments, telling me what they've done, and so we have some interesting conversations after that.
Dad is cracking the whip there.
Yeah.
Professor Dad to you. Dr. Dad.
Doing my best to make them hate me, yeah.
And learning all the while.
Well, we're joined by Dr. Charlie Camosy, professor of ethics at Fordham University. It seems like every time we have you on, I have to say, where do we start? There's just so many things that we can be talking about. Maybe let's start, how about this, Charlie? Maybe we'll ramp up a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about, certainly, I mean, there's obviously very significant and major things to be concerned about ethically and morally in our world. But something that seems to be affecting a great majority of people are some of the ethical choices that are being made with respect to the coronavirus pandemic. And some of them, I would say, it might be an opportunity for you and for us to have a conversation about kind of the basics of moral and ethical principles in the first place, because a lot of them do seem to be people making a choice between what's good for me and what's good for other people, right?
Right. I mean, and we've discussed this many times, but Catholic social teaching requires us to think about the common good and the dignity of the human person ahead of our own personal desires and wants, and sometimes even our needs. I often ask my faith and critical reason freshmen, what is it that you'll die for? And that also shows you where your treasure is buried in a dramatic way too. But we're faced with these questions now. You know, do we go to church? Do we go to a drive-in church? Do we can we invite our priest over to give last rites to a family member of ours? And a whole bunch of choices in between, thinking about these questions. But I guess there's one thing this pandemic has revealed, is that the idea that we can act for our own interests apart from the common good is put on full display as being just utterly false.
Well, because we certainly have everything from a macro to a one person. There have been some cities counties and states that have either insisted on people staying in home. I saw a video somewhere, I think it was outside the United States, it was somewhere else in the world, where they're insisting on people riding mass transit need to have some sort of face covering, and someone who was being forcibly dragged off some sort of city bus. Did you see that?
Yes.
And the guy's like kicking and screaming, and it's got like 4 police officers pulling him off there. Maybe let's, just for that as a microcosm, not to pick on that guy, but to say, let's talk about Catholic social teaching or ethical decisions based on some, like I would imagine in moral theology class, you use little case studies. So let's see if that's a case study. So what is that guy choosing versus what we might think he should choose, perhaps ethically? Or let's to be fair, let's say, could an ethical argument be made for what he was choosing?
Well, I've seen arguments made for almost anything in ethics, so we don't want to go down that road.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry.
I could make it if you want. I just want to note some whiplash I've had. We've gone from people telling us don't wear face masks to being like physically railroaded out of a moving vehicle because you're not wearing a face mask. So we've had some different advice here about this that I think is worth noting. But in general, the common good there seems to be lots of data to show that the common good is being served by people wearing these masks. I mean, the countries that have dealt with SARS and other outbreaks in the past, especially in Southeast Asia, were in some ways had much better outcomes because they were ready for this because of other outbreaks they've had, and they almost all wear masks. And it's almost that they wear, I mean, maybe we've even seen people from these countries at airports and they're wearing masks, and it looks kind of like, well, that's different from our culture, but I think it's soon to be our culture. I think we're especially since this probably won't die down in a to zero way until we have a vaccine, which isn't going to be for another year and a half. Our what it means to serve the common good when we travel is going to change, and I think part of it will be wearing masks. Now, is it uncomfortable? Is it countercultural? Maybe both. But at the end of the day, if what we're doing is serving the common good, and there seems to be a lot of data to show that it is, and I think we kind of already knew that when we were told we shouldn't be wearing masks. But this seems to be a small price to pay for the common good.
So. To be real, and I'm trying to back away from being cynical, but do you think that maybe because largely, if we are talking about a longer timeline, like you just mentioned, and that like a lot of people are mentioning now, it's not just like, oh, we got to hunker down for a couple of weeks, we'll do whatever, we'll do yoga at home, and we'll order Seamless, and we'll be fine. Now that we're talking about really a genuine kind of change of lifestyle for a lot of people, I guess I'm wondering if what people have been doing up to now is really sort of an altruistic or a Christian, other-centered, caring about the common good, or is it caring about me? Like I don't want to get this, and I don't want my family to get this. And are we still just as bad at, caring about the common good as we ever were?
That's a wonderfully cynical question. I appreciate your critical analysis here.
That's typically not how he is, by the way. The pandemic is affecting everyone's genuine nature.
No, I know. That's why. Okay, but all right. No, I don't know. It stood out for me, but I've been thinking about that question too, and I've actually been looking hard at my own reasons for wanting to be. I mean, we get all our groceries delivered. We hand wipe everything down that comes into the house. We have Purell stations at every entrance, for people to use. And I have to say, the main reason I have in mind, if I'm honest with myself, is little Thaddeus had, who's now almost going to be 2 years old, believe it or not, had 2 bouts of pneumonia over 6 months right before this happened. And our pediatrician said that he's in particular danger because his lungs are not in good shape from those 2 bouts of pneumonia. So, I can tell the world that we're doing this and we're hunkering down, we're doing this for the common good. But I think your question is one that I need to ask myself. And like, what is actually going on here? It is other-centered in one sense. It's about my son. I hope that most of us would be fine beyond him. But you never know, obviously. But if I'm honest with myself, it is about protecting my son. That it's not really about this broader common good that's motivating my actions.
Right.
And if someone were to say tomorrow, it turns out he's fine, the lungs are fine, I'm not so sure I would be I probably would go to the store more. I probably would,
Okay.
do some other things. I probably would stay home in some sense, but I probably wouldn't be as dramatic in my self-isolate or our isolation as a family.
So we also have seen examples, and I've been over the weekend because it was Easter. I was on a few secular media outlets, and some of the questions I've been getting have been about not too many Catholics, but there have been certainly some examples of Christian churches in various places here in the U.S. anyway, that have sort of defiantly gone against the governmental restrictions of not gathering in large groups. And because it was Easter, if this happened in the middle of the summer, maybe it would have been a different story. But I mean, I've seen video on TV and on the internet of some Christian pastors saying, we are called to worship the Lord, and that is above all. And quite frankly, I mean, if you do look at the scriptures, there are a lot of examples. Right now, we're entering into the time where we're reading from the Acts of the Apostles. I mean, we're going to be hearing readings over the next few days and few weeks where essentially the brand new Christian church is saying to the established authority, we're not listening to you because we take our orders from God and not from men. And quite frankly, that is what I've heard a lot of people argue. Okay, the governor can tell us not to get together, but darn it, our God is of a higher authority. So on one hand, you can see where that's coming from. But I guess we also need to be doing the difficult work that you and I often talk about, Dr. Camosy, the fact that it's not a zero sum, and we need to be doing both. We need to, yes, be listening to the scriptures and worshiping our God, but also caring about the common good. What's been your reaction when you've seen some of these, like in the name of God or the Bible or Christianity, saying, no, government's wrong. We got to listen to God and come together and worship God in the church?
And to be honest with you, I have mixed feelings about this, and like you said, we've been in this mixed kind of gray, mushy area with regard to many complex issues. And I think this is one of them. So on the one hand, I do think it really means putting aside very minor things like where you're going to get your food from, what kind of food you get, how often you get to go take a walk, where you get to go take a walk, how often you see friends and family in person. Those are things we ought to sacrifice for the common good, it seems to me.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I don't agree with a lot of what these folks were arguing about and doing, but the principle seems right, that we are ultimately beholden to God and not to the authority, to the secular authority, right? That's who we're beholden to. We're not going to be called to answer to the governor of whatever state you happen to be listening in, or much less the president of the United States. We're going to be called to answer to God for our actions. Now, what that means in this particular situation is complex. I think almost everything can be subordinated to trying to save people's lives by sheltering in place or doing whatever it is we want to describe what we're doing. But I would argue there are some things that we ought to do that matter more. Like you and I were talking before we got on the air. I think we ought to allow priests to say last rites for people who are dying in hospitals and in their homes. And to be fair, there are important concerns about that, like will that spread the virus more, et cetera, et cetera. Priests are getting trained on using personal protective equipment and other things. But even if it marginally increases the rates of infection, I think that's something we need to think hard about. Are there values that we're willing to stand for that sometimes, not all the time, are more important than just doing a calculation about how many people might be infected as a result of this? And I think the value of having last rites or being able to say goodbye to a family member may be one of those things.
Well, I mean, yes, and I was, when I heard at lunch today that a friend of mine, a fellow Paulus, his sister works in a hospital in ICU, and they said they had decided just as of the last couple of days to allow family members into the hospital, into the ICU, into whatever room, to actually say goodbye and to put on protective equipment, but to have the absolutely, and maybe this is something that we can tease out in terms of Christian ethics or moral decision making, that absolutes almost always fail us, right? There's got to be some dialogue between, there are some things that are absolute, and we'll get to one of those.
There are some things.
We'll get to one of
those.
It's a
limited number of things
in just a minute.
Yeah.
But I mean, when we talk about an absolute verboten that no, if we let anybody in, like my mom is in a care facility for elderly people that has a nursing home wing. It's got assisted living. It's got independent apartments, and they have just Like all visitors, all family members are verboten and forbidden from entering for the last several weeks, regardless of, and obviously that is, they've also had, to be fair, out of 300 people that live there, 9 people have died in the last couple of weeks. So there's good reason for this. And yet I think what you're also raising up is, but all isn't also a value, the non-medical, non-physical dimension of how people suffer, that people have loneliness, that people already don't have, if you're living in an assisted living, already don't have your family come visit you very often, and those few times that you do, you look forward to, and now those are done, let alone when somebody's on death's door, to say that no, your family can't come into the room and pray with you and say goodbye. Isn't that worth at least as much? And I think that's what you're saying, that we've got to juggle these things, and it's not easy, right?
There's no math equation or, sort of theoretical apparatus we can weigh and hit some buttons on a calculator and come out with the right answer to that question. I mean, it's what the Catholic moral theology we call the virtue of prudence, that leads us to and in prayer with God to enlighten our reason and our prudential judgment to make those calls. But again, I don't think it can be as simple as, well, obviously you would do it, or obviously you shouldn't do it. I'll tell you a quick story from a colleague of mine in medical ethics that got me thinking about this. She wrote me after I was writing some stuff about trying to protect older people from being denied ICU care and from getting care in a hospital. She said, that's good, but what about somebody like my 90-year-old mother who, if she were to enter the meat grinder of the ICU and get intubated, would almost certainly die and die alone there? Why shouldn't she be able to choose to get whatever care can be provided at home and then hospice, if that's what it ultimately comes up to be the case? And right now we don't allow that, or at least it's allowed in very limited circumstances. Sometimes it just happens because people end up dying of coronavirus at home. We don't know about it. That's a big underreported part of all this. But that got me thinking, and I said, why not? And then people said, well, there could be higher rates of infection. Again, the family members, if a priest comes, the home hospice workers themselves. But at the end of the day, are we just doing raw calculations about, according to my calculations, this percentage would go higher, or are there some values that we're just willing, through a prudential judgment and prayerful kind of reflection, say, you know what, it might marginally raise the chances of the family getting coronavirus, but if they all want to agree to be in the same room when that person dies and say goodbye, that's something we ought to allow families to decide.
Our guest on the Busted Halo show is Professor Charlie Camosy. His most recent book is called Resisting Throwaway Culture: How a Consistent Life Ethic Can Unite a Fractured People. We cover a lot of topics in that book. One of them, not surprisingly, because you speak and write and teach a lot about this, the topic of abortion. Here during coronavirus, I guess we should have anticipated that at some point this would be politicized. One of the current battles right now is the state of Texas versus the U.S. Supreme Court, and the state of Texas declaring that that abortion is not an essential procedure, an essential thing that needs to happen right now, and they've effectively shut down almost all of their opportunities, abortion clinics, or their opportunities for abortion. And there's people trying to fight this at the Supreme Court level and argue that abortion is an essential service. I guess I don't have to wonder what your reaction to that statement is, Dr. Camosy.
Right. It's kind of like the terrible downside reaction to what people are already calling the corona baby boom, right? Like, because all of us are staying in, there might be a bumper crop in the works about 9 or 10 months from now.
Bumper crop.
One way to look on that is that's why we need more abortions, right? So we get more access to abortion because of that. Father Dave, I just need to say this pretty directly. The people who are arguing that abortion is just like any other kind of healthcare are so disingenuous about that, because, well, first of all, it's not. Killing a child is obviously not an example of healthcare, but even if it is, then you should be responsible for the criteria that other healthcare examples of healthcare are using. And here's what's actually happening. People who need cancer treatments are not getting their cancer treatments because they've been designated as not essential. People who needed liver transplants are waiting on the liver transplant because they've been designated non-essential. Now you're going to tell me that abortion is essential and therefore has to stay open? That's just cheating. If it's healthcare, play by the rules. You are definitely not an example of essential healthcare. Therefore, you should be shut down, and we should turn abortion clinics into ICU units where they're needed. It's just so blatantly obvious what's happening here and it's really kind of gross.
Dr. Charlie Camosy is our guest here on the Busted Halo Show. Always good to get the ethical perspective on a lot of things that are going on in the world. Is there anything else that you've noticed from inside these little boxes that we're all in now that might be something that the rest of us are missing, that, you know, this might turn into more of a thing than we're anticipating? I mean, one of the things that occurs to me, but I am interested in yours, just kind of, you mentioned it before, the dignity of the human person is so fundamental to Catholic social teaching, and a dimension of that we've seen in papal documents and other sources of Catholic teaching is the dignity of work. And we've got off the charts skyrocketing unemployment. Is that a factor here?
Absolutely. And I just connect with it more broadly. Work is one of the ways that many people just interact with others, right? They get out of their own house, out of their own heads, and interact with other people and have those kind of encounters. I in my book, I talk about the culture of encounter as being the antidote to the throwaway culture. And I also talk about how even, you know, the book was obviously written before the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, we were just ridiculously lonely people, especially my young students who are on social media all the time and rarely date, rarely have meaningful interactions, at least compared to my generation at the same age. And I'm really worried that when you talk about work, when you talk about social isolation, that this is going to kick an already alarming trend into some kind of hyperdrive that's really dangerous and really difficult. And so I think it's imperative it's an imperative for us to think as creatively as we possibly can about how to get people interacting with each other again. Not in a way that's irresponsible, not in a way that doesn't pay attention to what the latest epidemiological data suggests about how the virus is transmitted. Not about not flying the curve or something like that, but acknowledging that and it's not about the stock market or something like that, but acknowledging that there's a super important good on the other side of this. And work is a major part of it. Genuine friendship and interaction with family is another part of it. But just that we were made to be in relationships with each other. That's what we were created. We're created in the image of a triune God whose essential nature is to be in relationships, right? And here we are, many of us, quarantined, isolated, sheltering in place, living in ways we were not made to live. And that has got to be a primary concern going forward. Again, we shouldn't reduce it to the economy or to people's 401ks or, greed or something like that. That's not what this is about. It's about, as responsibly as we can, thinking about this other way that we're meant to be in the world.
Well, so an example of that might be people are talking about sporting events and arenas or concerts. Brett's a big fan of the concerts and whatnot. Right. Other than sports makes a lot of money, and other than that's hurting the economy, there's also something different about being at a baseball game or at a concert. I'll tell you this, Brett. Yeah. Than there is about watching those things on a small laptop screen or on your mobile phone. And when I say different, I don't just mean we have a better time. I think it's kind of what you're touching on. Dr. Charlie Camosy joining us here on the Busted Halo Show. What it is about human people. We are created relationally, and there's plenty of ways that I think we're discovering new ways that we can genuinely have encounter. You do say in your book that counters our throwaway culture is to have encounter. Obviously, we can have a lot of encounters. People are having Zoom happy hours and a little house party app where you're playing Pictionary with your friends, but it's not an either or, but there's also other more fleshed out, literally, dimensions of encounter that do happen during those times of gathering. And to have I mentioned concerts and sporting events. I probably should have also mentioned church. What we can do when we gather around the table of the Lord together. And as much as people have been asking for as long as I've been doing this show, how come we have to hold hands at the sign of peace or shake each other's hand? I mean, that is an important human dimension of our faith, right?
I saw a funny tweet from a pretty traditional, almost rad traddy Catholic today saying, maybe when this is all over, I'll actually shake the hands during sign of peace because
maybe.
he's not ready to go quite there yet.
Not there yet.
Not there yet. One of the ways we started talking about school and this all going online, and yes, there are new and creative ways to having, the semblance of encounters via Zoom or via, FaceTime or something, but I'm just going to go to the mat for the personal encounter. Brett knows, being at a concert and being in the physical presence of music and having it rattle through your whole body is just a totally different thing than,
yep.
Pressing a button on your phone or something. And same is true of teaching. Same is true. We had a family call on Easter, and it was fine. It was good, but I guess it was better than nothing. But it wasn't what Easter would normally be at all. And I just worry that we're already moving towards this disembodied, press a button on your phone to get something that comes from Amazon, press a button on your phone. Yeah, I recently discovered, I must admit, that you can have alcohol delivered to your house, instead of going down to the store,
That's one of the silver linings of this whole thing, Charlie.
I'm afraid this might take off for our family after this is all over.
Data would show.
The signs point to, but I'm worried about this trend. And we've had department meetings over Zoom, and I must admit that I was a fan of those as well. I didn't have to go drive into the Bronx from New Jersey. But these are not happy things for me to actually point to and realize about myself, because I think a lot of other people are going to be in the same box and we're in the same situation and say, well, I don't really need to go home for Easter. We'll just have the Zoom thing. Or I don't think we need to have this meeting in person. We can just have it on Zoom. Or, you know what? Let's move to a hybrid version of our courses where some of it's online and some of it's in person. These are good. I mean, the technology is good. It's serving a purpose, but at the same time, I think there's really something at risk here, and we want to hold on to, and that's the embodied, and that's what a sacramental religion like the Catholic faith really holds on to, is the stuffness, the embodiedness of this that I think we really need to hold on to.
I mean, just weird. We got to let you go because we're getting to the end of our time here. But I mean, just how weird it was, not only to celebrate the Triduum, the liturgies of the Holy Week with all those rituals, but to actually get directives from various dioceses and archdioceses, like, do not do this, don't light the fire, no foot washing. It's like, not just like, oh, we're going to miss it, but it's like, do not. And what you just pointed out, this is what we look forward to and live for throughout the year, is to have more sacramental experiences like this. So you're right. It's
got to be hard on priests, right? Like this is
very hard.
Got to be hard on priests.
It is. Dr. Charlie Camosy, thank you so much for joining us here on the Busted Halo Show, as always.
My pleasure.
All right, we'll see you again. I hope see you more in person.
Let's do it again soon.
We'll have an account.
But after we bash all the Zoom things, we're like, we'll Zoom you again next week.
Let's do the Zoom thing.
I love it.
And he's like, ding dong. Oh, sorry.
Drizzly's here. Oh, yes.
That's
Drizzly?
Yes.
That's the alcohol delivery. He's looking out his window.
I see there might be some gin coming my way. So.
All right, we're going to take a little break. We'll be right back here on the Busted Halo Show on the Catholic Channel, Sirius XM 129.